Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his article, Gods, John Wisdom, after considering what he calls the various logics that could be that of disputes having to do with the existence of God, and noticing that they're most similar to aesthetic differences, although not reducible to aesthetic differences, he's going to bring up what he calls a connecting technique. Then he's going to talk about disconnecting, and then he's also going to bring up the issue of unspoken, or perhaps you could say unconscious connections. Now, why is this important? Well, when it comes to determining these sorts of disputes in which there is a right and a wrong, or correct or incorrect, appropriate, inappropriate, rational, irrational, we give reasons, they're not simply deductive arguments, and they're not simply inductive either. We want to draw analogies, we want to draw connections to things, and that often helps us when we're looking at exactly the same picture or exactly the same facts to arrive at a different interpretation of them. So he calls this the connecting technique in section 7. So he says, let's consider again the technique used in revealing or proving beauty. So aesthetic matters. In removing a blindness, that's a much broader thing, which could apply to all sorts of spheres, domains. In inducing an attitude which is lacking and reducing a reaction that is inappropriate. So what do we typically do? He gives you a number of different things. We could run over in a special way the features of the picture, pay attention to that, look at what's going on over here. Tracing rhythms, obviously that applies to music, which is an example he's used. Making sure that this and that are not only seen, but noticed, and their relation to each other. So this is something we do quite frequently. You know, somebody's like, I don't get anything out of that piece of music. And we're like, well, listen to it again. Really listen to it. Now pay attention to this part right here. Now, do you hear how that is connected to what just went on earlier in the piece of music? And that's sort of a clue here. He says, besides all of this, there's other things we can do to justify our attitude and alter that of the person who cannot see. How? Features of the picture may be brought out by setting beside it other pictures. You know, you can take an image and say, okay, look at these two images. Do you see how this is actually incorporating aspects of this and building upon it? Or look at how different they are, or look how similar they are. He says, just as the merits of an argument may be brought out, proved by setting it beside other arguments, in which striking but irrelevant features of the original are changed and relevant features emphasized. And he gives a third example here, a biblical one. Just as the merits and demerits of a line of action may be brought out by setting beside it other actions. To use Susan Stebbing's example, Nathan, the prophet, brought out for David, the king of Israel, certain features of what David had done in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And if you don't know that story, Uriah the Hittite had a wife, Bathsheba. David was spying on her, saw her bathing naked, got all hot and bothered for her, said, well, I'm going to get my hands on her, and sent her husband Uriah the Hittite out into the front lines to get killed. Then he took her and had sex with her, and then a terrible plague, happened, right? And David was like, who caused this trouble? It's sort of like the meme that we have these days of the guy dressed in the hot dog suit who's like, who could have done this, right? And everyone's like, you, buddy, you're the guy, right? So Nathan tells a story about two sheep owners, and David's like, oh, that guy, he did a bad thing. And then, Nathan is like, that's you dummy. So this is, like he says, this is the kind of thing we do when someone is inconsistent or unreasonable. And this is what we do in referring to other cases in law. Right? We often engage in this sort of analogizing, of drawing connections. Comparison, analogy, these are the ways we do it. Now, is this perfect? No, because analogies can often go different ways. And so wisdom has a great example of one here. A may have noticed in B subtle and hidden likenesses to an angel, and he reveals these to C, where C says, I've noticed in B subtle and hidden likenesses to a devil, and he reveals them to A. It could go either way, right? Maybe D is like, yeah, both of you are wrong. I think that this B bears resemblance to just an ordinary guy. He also talks about the interesting example of somebody picking up flowers that lie half withered on a table and gently putting them in water. Another person says to them, you believe flowers feel. He says this though he knows that the person who helps the flowers doesn't expect anything of them, which he doesn't expect, for he himself expects the flowers to be refreshed and to be easily hurt, injured, by rough handling, where the man who puts them in water does not expect them to whisper, thank you. The skeptic says, you believe flowers feel because something about the way the other man lifts the flowers and puts them in the water suggests an attitude to the flowers, which he feels inappropriate, though perhaps he would not feel it inappropriate to butterflies. He feels it's like a lover's attitude, right? He says a lover's attitude is somewhat crazy, even when this is not a matter of his having false hopes about how the person he is in love with will act. And we often say, as wisdom says, reasoning is useless. The person is crazy with love, right? And is that really the case? Wisdom says, no, because even the people who say it's useless to reason proceed at once to reason with the lover, and sometimes that reasoning actually has effects. He gives the example. We can draw the lover's attention to certain things done by her he is in love with and trace for him a path from these things done by others at other times. Notice we're doing comparison here, right? Which have disgusted and infuriated him. And by this means, we may weaken his admiration and confidence and make him feel it unjustified and arouse his suspicion and contempt and make him feel our suspicion and contempt reasonable. So, it's not the case that if somebody has strong feelings, we can't use any reasoning with them. We draw connections, and we do that by comparison and analogy. Now, does it always work? No, because we can actually notice and accept connections, even alter our state, but not completely change it. So he talks, for example, about a case here where somebody has altered their love, but they still love. And in that case, notice where he's going with this. We then feel perhaps it is we who are blind and cannot see what he can see. That's an interesting line that he's going to discuss a little bit more later on. But first, we want to talk about disconnecting. So we have a connecting technique. We're not always going to be using that. We may use the opposite. And why would we do that? He says that sometimes a person has an attitude which it seems to us they shouldn't have, or they lack one which they should have. And not only do we suspect he's not influenced by connections which we feel should influence him, and we draw attention to these, but We suspect he is influenced by connections which should not influence him, and we draw his attention to these. It may for a moment seem strange. We should draw his attention to connections which we feel should not influence him, and which, since they do, he has in a sense already noticed, but we do, such as our confidence in the light of reason. So we often point out to somebody, hey, your reasoning processes are corrupted, flawed, biased. You're not thinking things through properly, is often how we talk about it. And he'll give an example, fallacies, right? He talks, for example, about the Monte Carlo fallacy, mismanaging the laws of chance. A person passes from noticing a certain color or number is not turned up for a long while to an improper confidence that will now show up, right? And so, when we're pointing out fallacies in reasoning, mismanagement of inference, not taking in certain information or weighing it in the wrong ways, that we might be helping to disconnect in that case. So connecting and disconnecting. Then we have a third important thing or technique, which wisdom is going to bring up, unspoken connections. And he says, usually, wrong-headedness or wrong-heartedness in a situation, blindness to what is there or seeing what is not, does not arise merely from mismanagement of language, which is what disconnecting pertains to, but is more due to connections which are not mishandled in language because they're not put into language at all. They are essentially unconscious or implicit. He says, these too often weaken in the light of reason if we can guess where they lie and turn it on them. So this requires some sort of work to bring them up into the light of consciousness, so to speak. So he says that, this is not the same thing as correcting mismanagement of language, but it's akin to it. It involves setting out fairly what has been set out unfairly, right? Or not at all. And we must remember the line between connections ill-presented or half-presented in language and connections operative but not presented is not a sharp one. And actually, we're bringing these things into language. And he says, we can call this reasoning to remove bad unconscious reasoning, or we can call it other things. But what we're engaging in there is trying to figure out why a person has come to the conclusions that they have. And here he's going to bring up an important distinction that he knows his audience will be raising, the distinction between the question, what reasons are there for the belief that S is P? And the question, what are the sources of beliefs that S is P? Sometimes these can coincide. Sometimes they're quite different from each other. So he says, this is a question about what's logically relevant and what's not. So if we take a mathematical theorem, we ask for the proof, offer the generalization that parental discord causes crime. We ask for the correlation coefficients. But he says, in this last case, if we think that only the figures are reasons, we underestimate the complexity of the logic of our conclusion, but it's difficult to describe the other features of the evidence, and there's going to be disagreement about the weight they should have. So he says we do have to distinguish between, the reasons there are for conclusions, but also decide what things are reason and how much. And he calls this a process of sifting reasons from causes. And he notes that, in some areas, this has already been done for us. We've already got that figured out. In a lot of areas that matter to us, maybe it hasn't actually been done quite so well. And he says, even in science or on the stock exchange or in ordinary life, we sometimes hesitate to condemn a belief or a hunch merely because those who believe it cannot offer the sort of reasons we'd hoped for. And he's going to give a very interesting contemporary at his time example. Now, from our vantage point, we all know that Picasso was an amazing painter and very important to the history of art,
That's been like a settled question. We may not appreciate exactly what's going on in his stuff, but we're like, yeah, father of a very important movement, and look at how great his work is. Well, that was not the attitude of the time. And he talks about Gertrude Stein as an early advocate of Picasso's work at a time when many people were like, this is garbage. This is awful. So he says, suppose Miss Gertrude Stein finds excellent the work of a new artist while we see nothing in it. We nervously recall, perhaps, how pictures by Picasso, which Miss Stein admired and others rejected, later came to be admired by many who gave attention to them. And we wonder whether the case is not a new instance of her perspicacity and our blindness, right? But is every case of Picasso? No. What if we find out that she just happens to like birds, and there's a lot of birds in these new artists' painting? We might be like, maybe this is not like the Picasso case. Maybe it's just a matter of her, being moved by these unspoken connections that she hasn't drawn out, right? He says, we notice the subject matter of the new pictures is perhaps birds in wild places. We learn that Miss Stein is a bird watcher. Then we're less worried about her admiration. Maybe she sees something that we don't. Probably not. But what if it is another Picasso? What if we're the ones who are a bit off base? And he's going to actually conclude with something quite interesting here, which leads us into a different line of discussion. He says that it must not be forgotten our attempt to show up misconnections in Miss Stein may have an opposite result and reveal to us connections that we missed. And then he talks about psychoanalysis. Thinking to remove the spell exercised upon his patient by the old stories of the Greeks, the psychoanalyst may himself fall under that spell and find in them what his patient has found, and incidentally, what made the Greeks tell those tales. Connections are something that we're sort of awash in, and we're not always ourselves completely aware of the work that connections are doing in producing attitudes, in leading to conclusions through inferences about aesthetic matters, or, to go back to the original topic of this article, about whether gods exist or not, and perhaps what those gods would be like. So very important distinctions here that are being drawn, and noticing that we often use analogy and comparison both negatively and positively, and also in a way dredging things up into the light so we can look at them in order to decide these matters for ourselves and in relation to others who might disagree with us.